There is a warehouse on the outskirts of Louisville, Kentucky, that most people will never hear about. It looks like any other fulfillment center from the outside: loading docks, a parking lot full of 18-wheelers, fluorescent lights burning well past midnight. But what moves through those doors is not consumer electronics or athletic shoes. It is medicine. Hundreds of thousands of bottles, blister packs, amber vials, aspirin, chemotherapy agents, blood pressure drugs, insulin, opioids still sealed in their original packaging. And almost none of it is going to a patient. It is going to a furnace. Every year in the United States, somewhere between $13 and $17 billion worth of pharmaceutical products flows backwards through what the industry quietly calls reverse distribution. These drugs leave hospital pharmacy shelves, get loaded onto climate-controlled trucks, and pass through processing facilities run by companies most people have never heard of: Inmar Intelligence, PharmaLink, Pharma Logistics, Return Management Systems. At the end of that journey, the overwhelming majority is incinerated, melted down, rendered, in the Drug Enforcement Administration's precise clinical phrasing, non-retrievable. That phrase, non-retrievable, is doing a great deal of work. It means the drug can no longer be recovered, repurposed, or redistributed anywhere in the supply chain. It is gone, not gone to a patient in a country that cannot afford the commercial price, not gone to a free clinic 2 miles from the hospital where it sat unused, not routed to a humanitarian aid organization, not passed along to a nurse practitioner in a rural county with no pharmacy within 30 miles. Just gone. Ash and emissions from a licensed medical waste incinerator, and a credit memo flowing upstream. That number deserves a moment. $13 billion. For context, that is roughly twice the entire annual budget of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It is more than the United States federal government spends on the Indian Health Service and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration combined. It is enough insulin to treat every diabetic in sub-Saharan Africa for years. And it happens not because of some policy failure or corporate negligence, but because of a set of financial incentives so precisely interlocking that destroying medicine is, in many cases, the single most rational economic decision anyone in the supply chain can make. This is how that works. Start with a single vial. A hospital pharmacy in Columbus, Ohio, orders a supply of pembrolizumab, a cancer immunotherapy drug that runs roughly $10,000 per dose, in anticipation of a patient cohort that ends up smaller than projected. The vials sit in a refrigerated cabinet for weeks. They are not damaged. They are not contaminated. They are not recalled. They are, by every clinical and pharmacological measure, perfectly good medicine. But the clock is ticking. Drug manufacturers set expiration dates based on stability testing submitted to the FDA, and most US prescription drugs carry dates between 1 and 5 years from manufacture. Once that date passes, or once it approaches close enough that a downstream recipient will refuse to accept the product, the vial becomes legally and financially a liability rather than an asset. The hospital cannot send it to another hospital. It cannot donate it to a community health clinic in an underserved neighborhood. It cannot mail it to an out-of-state patient who needs it and cannot afford the list price. Under current law, under the regulatory framework governing controlled and non-controlled substances alike, the hospital's only practical option is to hand the vial to a reverse distributor registered with the DEA and receive, in return, a credit memo from the manufacturer. That credit memo is the engine of the entire system, and understanding why requires following the money through each link in the chain. Here is how the math works at the individual transaction level. a manufacturer sells a drug to a pharmaceutical wholesaler, a McKesson or an AmerisourceBergen, at, say, $800 per vial. The wholesaler sells it to a hospital at $850. The hospital does not use its full order. It sends the surplus to a reverse distributor. The reverse distributor catalogs each product, logs the lot numbers and serial identifiers required by federal law, and ships it either back to the manufacturer's returns facility or, in the majority of cases, directly to a licensed incinerator. The manufacturer then issues a credit, typically between 75% and 100% of the original invoice price, back up the chain. The hospital recoups most of its money. The reverse distributor takes a processing fee, usually calculated as a percentage of the credit it secures. The manufacturer destroys the product, takes a tax write-down on the loss, and prices the cost of that destruction into the list price of the next batch. Nobody in that chain loses enough to change their behavior, except the system as a whole, which just incinerated $800 worth of medicine in order to generate a $750 credit memo. Now multiply that vial by 120 million units. That is the documented scale of the problem. The Healthcare Distribution Alliance, the trade association for pharmaceutical wholesalers, published a detailed analysis finding that more than 120 million product units move through reverse distribution every year in the United States, representing over $13 billion in value at the manufacturer level. Of that staggering total, the HDA estimates that roughly $7 billion worth, more than half, represents resaleable product. Goods that are physically intact, within their labeled expiration date, stored correctly, and by every objective pharmacological measure usable. That product gets destroyed anyway, because reselling returned pharmaceuticals back into the United States supply chain is, under the current regulatory architecture, essentially impossible to do profitably and legally at any meaningful scale. The mechanism that made redistribution impossible was well-intentioned. The Drug Supply Chain Security Act, known as DSCSA, signed into law in 2013 and reaching full unit-level serialization enforcement in late 2024, requires that every prescription drug package in the United States supply chain carry a unique product identifier, and that every handoff of that package be electronically logged and traceable from the point of manufacture all the way to the dispensing pharmacy. This was designed to prevent counterfeit drugs from infiltrating the supply chain, and it does prevent that. The FDA credits robust traceability with making the United States drug supply among the safest in the world. But the DSCSA simultaneously created a compliance burden so technically demanding that routing a legitimate, unexpired, serialized drug back into active circulation requires a verification infrastructure investment that most reverse distributors have never built, and that most manufacturers have no financial incentive to build. The credit system already makes them whole. Why invest in the technical capacity to reintroduce returned product when destroying it? And issuing a credit is cheaper, faster, and legally clean. The law that protects patients from counterfeit drugs simultaneously makes it economically irrational to save perfectly good ones. The 2016 Memorial Sloan Kettering study put a specific number on one slice of this. Researchers publishing in the BMJ found that Medicare and private insurers together waste nearly $3 billion in cancer drugs every year. The mechanism they identified was not fraud. It was not negligence or regulatory failure. It was the single-dose vial. Oncology drugs, products that cost $10,000, $15,000, sometimes $30,000 per infusion, are manufactured and sold by pharmaceutical companies in standardized, fixed-volume vials. A vial contains 500 milligrams of active compound. A patient, dosed by body weight according to her oncologist's protocol, requires 380 milligrams. The nurse draws the precise dose, administers it through an IV line, and the remaining 120 milligrams in that open vial, worth somewhere between $7,000 and $12,000 depending on the drug, cannot be saved for the next infusion, cannot be transferred down the hall to a different patient, cannot be held even for 24 hours under most oncology standards. It goes into biohazard waste. In 2018 alone, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services calculated that $725 million worth of drugs reimbursed by Medicare Part B were physically discarded in a single calendar year. Not lost, not stolen, not expired before they could be used. Discarded. Residue in vials that were opened, partially used, and thrown away. That is the dirty math on cancer drugs alone. Now layer everything else on top of it. The DEA's own public records show that since 2010, its biannual National Prescription Drug Take-Back Days have collected more than £9 million of unused medications from American households and individuals. £9 million of pills, capsules, and liquids that patients were prescribed could not finish or decided they no longer wanted, and that had no legal pathway back into the supply chain. They were incinerated, every pound of them. Separately, industry surveys of pharmaceutical manufacturers have found that 72% of all manufacturer return credits they issued were triggered solely by expiration. Not product damage, not quality failures, not contamination events, just a date printed on a label, counting down to the moment a drug becomes legally unsaleable, regardless of its actual condition. Here is where the story becomes structurally interesting and where the industry gets uncomfortable. The Group Purchasing Organizations, GPOMS, are the procurement backbone of American hospital medicine. Roughly 96% of US hospitals buy their drugs through GPO contracts. These are entities like Vizient, Premier, and Inmar that negotiate bulk pricing agreements with drug manufacturers in exchange for volume purchase commitments from their hospital members. The deal structure is simple. Commit to purchasing a large quantity and receive a lower per unit price. The more you commit to buying, the better the price. The incentive this creates is systematic overcommitment. A hospital financial analyst evaluating a GPO contract for a cardiac medication might find that committing to 5,000 units at the discounted price saves $12 per unit, $60,000 total, compared to buying 3,000 units at the standard contract price. Even if the hospital only uses 4,000 units and sends 1,000 back through reverse distribution, recovering perhaps $700 in credit per unit, the acquisition side math still comes out ahead of the conservative purchasing option. The budget cycle rewards the upfront savings. Nobody's compensation is adjusted downward when vials go to the incinerator in the back half of the fiscal year. Acquisition efficiency and utilization efficiency are tracked by entirely different departments, evaluated against entirely different benchmarks, and reported to entirely different decision makers. The waste is not a side effect of this incentive structure. It is the predictable output. And then there is a second perverse mechanism, buried deeper still, in a federal program called 340B. The 340B drug pricing program was enacted in 1992 with a genuine public health purpose: to help safety net hospitals, facilities serving large proportions of uninsured and Medicaid patients, access drugs at sharply discounted prices, so those savings could be passed through to patients who could not otherwise afford care. Under 340B, eligible covered entities can purchase certain outpatient drugs at discounts that frequently exceed 50% of the commercial price. By 2023, purchases through the 340B program exceeded $66 billion per year, up from roughly $6 billion in 2010, a tenfold increase in 13 years. But a Government Accountability Office investigation in 2018 found that 57% of hospitals participating in the program did not pass those discounts on to patients. They kept the spread. A hospital acquires a drug at $200 under 340B pricing. It bills Medicare or a private insurer at $1,000. It pockets $800 in margin. The drug does not need to be wasted for this mechanism to generate revenue. But the volume incentive it creates is enormous and structurally distorting. The more outpatient drug transactions a hospital cycles through, the more 340B spread it captures. Ordering aggressively, committing to more than patient volume justifies, is not a mistake in this financial environment. It is revenue strategy. To be clear about something, the institutions and companies operating within this system are not, for the most part, acting in bad faith. Every piece of the architecture has a legitimate origin story. The DEA's non-retrievable destruction standard for controlled substances exists because drug diversion is a documented, catastrophic public health problem. The opioid epidemic, which killed more than 80,000 Americans in a single year at its peak, was substantially fueled by prescription opioids that leaked out of legitimate supply chains. Tightly controlled destruction requirements exist as a direct response to demonstrated harm. The DSCSA's serialization requirements exist because counterfeit medications have killed people. In 2008, contaminated heparin manufactured in China and distributed through gaps in the US supply chain killed 81 Americans and injured hundreds more. A traceability infrastructure that can identify a specific package, link it to a specific manufacturing lot, and verify every step of its custody is exactly the kind of protection that prevents events like that from recurring. The manufacturer credit system that anchors the reverse distribution economy exists because independent pharmacies, small businesses operating on thin margins, would otherwise absorb catastrophic financial losses every time an overstock aged out on a shelf. Each individual piece of this architecture solved a real documented problem. The difficulty is not any single piece. It is what all the pieces produce together. Inmar Intelligence describes itself as serving more than 50,000 pharmacies and processing returns for 84% of US hospitals. It frames its work as recovering value for healthcare organizations, and in narrow terms, it does. The credits it secures fund the next round of drug purchases. The DEA compliance infrastructure it provides prevents diversion violations. It is a rationally managed business operating efficiently within the framework it was given. The billions of dollars in annual destruction are not a failure of Inmar. They are a built-in feature of the regulatory and economic environment that Inmar was designed to navigate. The structural conclusion here is not that someone decided to build the world's largest medicine graveyard. Nobody sat in a conference room and chose this. What happened is that 4 or 5 separate institutions each made rational decisions to solve 4 or 5 separate urgent problems: diversion control, counterfeiting prevention, pharmacy financial protection, procurement efficiency, and safety net hospital funding. And the medicine graveyard is what the intersection of those decisions quietly produces, every single day, at scale. You are inside this system, whether you have ever thought about it. When your health insurance premium rises year over year, part of that increase is the actuarial shadow of pharmaceutical waste being priced into the cost of coverage. When you receive a Medicare explanation of benefits and a drug line item reads $1,200 for something that costs a fraction of that in Canada or Germany, some of that spread is margin built to cushion a return system that guarantees manufacturer revenue, even when the product is never administered to a human being. When public health researchers report that a cancer drug costs $150,000 per year in the United States and $40,000 in France, the difference is not purely research and development recoupment or manufacturing cost. It includes the invisible tax of a system where destruction is financially profitable and redistribution is functionally illegal. The warehouse outside Louisville keeps burning. Trucks pull in through the night, their climate-controlled holds carrying products worth more per pound than almost anything else that moves by road in this country. Loads are sorted, catalogued, logged against DEA registration numbers, cross-checked against serialization databases. Credits are calculated and transmitted. Invoices flow upstream to manufacturers. Tax write-downs flow into quarterly filings. And somewhere in a cancer infusion center in Ohio, an oncology nurse draws 380 milligrams of pembrolizumab from a 500 milligram vial, carefully administers the dose, sets the remainder aside, and marks the residue for disposal. Not because anyone instructed her to waste it, not because she does not understand what it is worth, but because every single rule governing the system she works inside leaves her no other choice. That is not a failure of individuals. That is a system working exactly as designed.